This incident was the most terrifying experience of my life. This happened in the fall of 1982 in Baxter State Park, Maine. I lived in Manchester, NH at the time, and desperately wanted to get one last camping trip in before the weather changed and the region would become buried in snow and tourists from out of state for the skiing season. It was early November, and it was still warm during the day and nice and chilly at night, perfect for sitting around the fire and relaxing. I love the outdoors. I still do, but the events of that night in Maine would leave a mark on me for the rest of my life. My wife worked all weekend at the hospital downtown, and both the kids were at Grandma and Grandpa's for the weekend. I called in sick to work, loaded up my Bronco, strapped the canoe on the roof, and hit the interstate. I was on the water late in the afternoon. I loved this area because of how remote it was. I was a few miles from my launch site, where the truck was parked, when I spotted a perfect place to camp. I paddled towards the shore. This is a great spot, I thought to myself. I set up my little tent, burnt a fire, and unfolded my pack chair to relax. The day turned into night, and I crashed out in the tent. The following day, I woke to the sounds of birds chirping. It was a little cooler, but still great weather. I took my camera out into the forest to take some pictures. I did some fishing, and just enjoyed the peaceful stillness of this remote wilderness. The day was uneventful, and soon after dinner, I lay in my tent with my flashlight reading. I must have dozed off because I awoke startled by something moving outside my tent. I lay still, but instinct told me there was something outside. I could hear the carefully placed steps of something. There are moose and black bear up here. Moose can be very dangerous if you walk upon them by surprise. The bears generally smell you before you see them and keep away. So I lay still and listened. Whatever it was had stopped at the entrance of the tent. As my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I could make out a faint, shadowy shape. I was wide awake now and on full alert. Whatever it was, I could hear it sniffing around and the panting of breath. I slowly began to unzip the tent when it ran off. I unzipped the flap of my tent and looked out just in time to see the branches swaying and hear the sound of something moving through the brush and into the deep woods. The sound of its footfalls told me one important thing. It was on 2 legs. This couldn't be right. I hadn't seen any other people since entering the park and leaving my truck at the trailhead. The tourist season for leaf peepers had passed, and even so, someone could only reach this location by the waterway. I suppose someone could be out here, someone I hadn't seen or heard until they came sniffing and snorting around my campsite in the middle of the night. I guess it was possible. As the sun rose, I ate my breakfast but remained on guard. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I felt a presence in the forest, someone or something just out of sight. I kept a .45 revolver when I camped out here in the North Woods. I wasn't concerned about the wildlife so much as the weirdos you might run across, the meth heads, the backcountry types. In my experience, the scariest thing you can come across when you're alone in the deep woods is another human. I couldn't be sure if someone was out there, but the paranoia had begun to take hold. It was dark now, and I was inside my tent. I kept the revolver close and my boots on. I was done playing games. I sure didn't plan on shooting anyone, but I was damn sure to show them I was no easy target. I sat up quickly. I must have fallen asleep again because I was startled awake by movement all around the tent. The shadows everywhere, on all sides, in all directions. I could hear sniffing and snorting, low grunting and raspy breathing. What the hell is happening? I thought in a panic. It didn't sound like people, but the height of the shadows cast against the flaps of the tent in the moonlight revealed prominent, upright figures. There must have been 5 or maybe 6 on all sides. Fear gripped me as the realization came over me. I was surrounded. The low growling started. It was answered back on the other side and all around me, low, deliberate growling. Were these coyotes? Were the massive shadows just the light playing tricks on me? The growling increased in pitch and intensified, and I knew an attack was imminent. I pulled my revolver and fired straight up into the air. The next moments were a complete blur. I charged through the tent with just the clothes on my back, my 45 and the truck keys in my pocket. I bolted straight for the canoe and muscled it into the water. I jumped in and began paddling. I never looked back until I got far enough from the shore. I should never have looked back. They were standing completely still on the riverbank, their bodies crouched down with heads low, eyes reflecting in the moonlight. They looked like giant coyotes, or maybe even wolves, 6 in total. I was transfixed by what I was seeing. I'd never seen a coyote this large, this massive. As I sat in the safety of my little canoe studying these creatures, they did something I will never forget. They began to stand up on their hind legs. Each one was slowly raised to 2 legs. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. They all stood like men, these things, these creatures that had almost ambushed me as their prey. I turned and furiously paddled as the howling rang out behind me. Now that my friends and I were teenagers, our parents were okay with us being out a little past dark. Up the road, behind our neighbourhood, was a church. Beyond that was an old abandoned apartment building. Attached to the church was a basketball court, so often, when we'd go and play, we would mischievously throw rocks and bricks through the windows of the apartment building, and then of course run. There's no better feeling as a teen than that of getting away with something. We never went around that building at night, except once, and after that, we never went anywhere near it again. It was dark, dilapidated, and utterly spooky. One night my friend John and I were bored, so we brought up the idea of exploring the inside of the building. "Dude, it's freaking dark in there," I said. "Yeah, which means there's nobody around, and we can do whatever we want." His plan did make sense, so we went, packing a flashlight each. Upon arrival, we searched for an entrance. We had to go around to the side, opposite that of the church, across from someone's backyard in a neighbouring street, which is precisely why we never went on that side before. As we turned the corner, we were greeted with a glass pan door up 3 steps. "Let's bust out the door," John said excitedly, but then we heard a noise. We looked in the direction of the door and saw a light was turned on inside. John took off running, but I was frozen with fear. Inside of the door was the dark silhouette of what looked like a very tall man in a hat. One of those professional hats, kind of like the type which airplane pilots would wear. I started to back away. John screamed in the distance, "Dude, what the hell are you doing? Let's go!" The man just stood there, staring at me from inside the building, not moving a muscle. The man very slowly opened the door and walked out. I backed away and then shone my light on him. He put his hand over his eyes to shield him from the light. He was wearing a bellhop uniform and hat, black slacks and black dress shoes. His skin was pale white. He flashed me a giant, unsettling grin and asked me a question. "Are you here to visit Miss Rose?" I dropped the light down to his feet, his big, browless, wild eyes glistening in the moonlight like a clothed skeleton. His skin so white, it was almost translucent. "She's been expecting you. Come on in." He gestured to me to come inside, before slowly taking steps towards me. I have to go." "Oh, I wouldn't do that," he continued. "Miss Rose has been waiting for you for a long time. In fact, she's the only tenant I have." I'm just a kid," I explained. John was long gone now. The man stepped a little closer. "I know it was you who vandalised my building. Those windows cost $500 each, and now that I can clearly describe you to the police, it's in your best interest to come inside, and if you do, I will let this go." Being only 13 and terrified of being in trouble, I completely abandoned the notion of not talking to strangers and walked inside. As I passed the doorman, he placed his hand on the small of my back and whispered, "Good." He smelled of beer and something else I couldn't put a finger on at the time. As I entered, I was greeted by a hallway with huge holes in the plaster, ripped up and stained carpeting, cobwebs, the smell of mildew, and, at the end of the hall, a staircase going up to the second floor. "Miss Rose lives in 2B. Kindly proceed upstairs." I don't want to, I really need to leave now. The precariousness of the situation finally hit me, before the lights went out, and I was standing in pitch darkness. I turned and couldn't see out the door window because the man was in between me and it. Terrifyingly, I then heard the unzipping of pants and the clanging of a belt as it dropped. His breathing began to deepen, which I can now only describe as excited sexual arousal. "We can't do this here," he whispered. I turned on my flashlight, which he instantly snatched from my hand. His pants and underwear were off, and he was exposed. "Keep moving up the stairs," he whispered, clenching his belt in the other hand, looped, as if he was planning on using it to strike me. And then, "Jacob?" A shrill, old female voice came out from up the stairs. "Jacob, did you catch me one?" "Yes, Miss Rose. He's on his way up," he replied, before giving me a terrifying gaze with those bulging, psychotic eyes. "Don't make me beat you unconscious." Henry Purcell's depressing piece, Dido's Lament, literally started to play upstairs. I backed up and turned towards the stairs, knowing what I was going to be forced to do. But then, from outside, the flashing of red and blue. I reacted and ran towards the man and shoved him. He caught me with a lash to the back from the belt, which was excruciating, but I made it outside screaming. The police searched the premises and arrested the man, a woman, and also found a child who went missing weeks ago. John had called the police immediately when he got home and told them where to go. It turns out the man, a crack addict named Jacob, and his mother Rose were involved in an incestuous relationship, and also both previously convicted sex offenders. I never found out what kind of sex offenders, but I had a good idea. As a creepy, unsettling matter of fact, Jacob was molested by his mother and a boyfriend for most of his childhood, prompting CYS to remove him from the home at 12 at the urging of one of his teachers. It wasn't until more than a decade later they reunited and began to engage in and rekindle a sexual relationship. Thank you, John, for saving my life. I should have listened. However, I'm glad this happened. Who knows what worse things would have been done to Timothy Dalton had we not showed up that day. I can't fathom what would have went through the mind of a 7-year-old during that time, and I don't want to know. The building has since been demolished. Jacob and Rose Kremley both remain in prison to this day, and still, Jacob proclaims his love for her. It's a sick world. For something a little bit different, I came across a really creepy story written into a poem by Red Midnight that I wanted to share. There is a man who walks behind me, a wretch without a name. It seems he lives to ever haunt me, my destruction his aim. The man has fixed me with his gaze, but never says a word. His mouth is stretched and open wide, a scream that isn't heard. There is a man who stands against me, with his armoury of lies. His withered hands remain unarmed, but murder is in his eyes. The man is silently taunting, crushing inspiration, beckoning me to constant violence, malicious invitation. There is a man who sleeps beside me, his breath felt on my ear. Yes, though he is my enemy, I wished him to stay near. The distortion has become welcome in my home, though the weight of him is much to bear, better him than to be alone.